You should be able to click continue on that. And now I'll introduce our speakers. Dr. Steve Sin is the director of the Unconventional Weapons and Technology Division at START, where he manages large research projects, explores new avenues for research, and establishes collaborative research relationships. He specializes in a broad range of international security, terrorism, and homeland security challenges. Megan Rudder is a junior researcher on the UWT team at START. She has worked on projects ranging in topics from CBRN use by violent non-state actors, red teaming and horizon scanning, and community-based violence prevention. And Rainer Washburn is a cyber intelligence researcher at START on the UWT team. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and then you all can take it away.
I believe if I just start slideshow, we should be good. Can you see the slideshow or are you seeing?
Yep, where's the slideshow?
Okay. All right. As Aaron introduced, I'm Megan Rudder. I'm a researcher on this project. Was conducted all of 2021 and the past 6 months, and we're going to be giving you kind of an overview of all of the work that we've done thus far. So our main goal was to look at the impact of an influence operation, and now this has been done in a different way by a lot of different focuses. So a lot of the research thus far has focused on how the information is disseminated and spread, whether that is Twitter retweet counts or like counts or things like that. There's been research on why people believe the information that's being disseminated and what types of information people believe more. I will get more into that on the next slide. There's also been a lot of research on the effect that mis and disinformation has on individuals and societies, and how to identify mis-disinformation and how to mitigate their effects. So this primarily uses a network propagation and duration as proxies for the impact of these influence operations. And there's been a lot less work that examines how influence operations can actually change a target's behavior and how that works through the online space. So again, there's been a lot of research that's done, I did not click that, sorry, on the influence operations, particularly in the individual level, which looks at kind of a variety of psychology and other factors such as the mere exposure effect, the permanency and recency effects, the continued influence effect of misinformation, and then internally an individual's insufficient integration, manipulation, and retraction of information, the dual processing theory, and other emotional theories, which posit the differences between fear, self-efficacy, and hope as far as the belief and in misinformation, the theories of reasoned action versus planned action, self-worth and victimization research, and credulity and attachment to belief systems, religious and ideological messaging. And then there's also research that looks at the societal level. So we especially looked into sociology research, communication research, health communication research, and other business avenues. And we found research on the social validation and influencer culture, rejection from society and refuge on the internet, community suffering and culture, and then research on societal gender strain, toxic masculinity, and unsuccessful sexual pairing, out-group versus in-group dynamics, and identity fusion, which is the theory that individuals have their identity fused with that of groups that they belong to, selective adoption, and culture of conspiracy and alternative sources, as well as histories of financial fragility and other financial problems throughout life. So what we found with all of this research and through our extensive lit review is that we found these common elements that can be used to look at the impact of influence. So you have at the top the exposure to the influence operations, that is receiving the information. And then in the large white circle is the observable societal level variables, which include, and these are all things that would be included in the messaging of an influence operation. So a persistent and increasing threat, the idea of an alternative future, a lack of response, clearly identifying the in-group versus out-group, and the social validation. And then we also found these observable individual level variables, which look at emotional appeal, threats to your identity, or threats to your culture / way of life, affirming your identity, affirming your victimhood, and victimization. However, we also found that there were some unmeasurable qualities that we wouldn't be able to look at in this research, which can include your specific identity, specific cultures, ideologies, and personal reactions of hope and fear. I will pass it to Reiner for how we use case studies to kind of look at these factors.
Thanks, Megan, and thank you all for joining. So we're moving into the area where we moved from, once we decided on the factors and we established our model as Megan was going through, we then started to perform 3 case studies. One was historical and 2 were ongoing at the start of this project and this work on foreign influence operations in order to further validate the model we were designing. So for the case studies, the 3 you see here, the first one was Operation Demmer, also informally known as Operation Infektion. And it was an influence operation conducted by the Soviet Union in the 1980s, which primarily focused on the conspiracy that the United States, US government in particular, created the HIV in order to eliminate communities in the United States, particularly Black and Brown communities. The second one is Operation Secondary Infection. And this was a Russian conducted operation, which was far-reaching and multifaceted, and it actually began all the way back in 2014 and was running up into the 2020s. And it was mostly to target perceived enemies of Russia, so Western nations, NATO, and so on and so forth. And then finally, we also conducted a case study of Chinese COVID influence operations. And so this was mostly surrounding on the narrative of the origin of the virus, how China was handling the issue, and then how they were doing assistance in the pandemic globally. And the big reason why we selected these case studies is because they did provide unique variations in both the temporal and the actor aspects of these operations. Next slide, please. Thank you. So with Operation Denver, we looked at this through what we have been designing as the influence action model. And out of that, we were able to identify 7 of the 11 factors, which can also be broken down to 3 out of 6 individual level factors, and then 4 out of 5 in societal level factors, both in the messaging that was used. From this, the factors that we identified were emotional appeal, threat to identity, victim affirmation, alternative future, a persistent and increasing threat, a lack of response, and a clearly identified in and out group. In the nutshell of it, with regards to Operation Denver, the narrative was incredibly simple. It was meant to be unified, cohesive, and consistent, and was really meant to exploit out-group dynamics and victimization narratives within Black and Brown communities that were suffering already from the AIDS epidemic. And it worked out to be, it was further amplified by trying to work its way into credible news sources. And this is what we call, in terms of the tactic, a narrative laundering. So this is where you push your narratives into these US news outlets and so forth, not even US, but globally, in order for the narrative to take hold and gain some type of legitimacy. And moreover, as we mentioned earlier with the exploited outgroup dynamics and victimization, it was very targeted to a specific group, and these were Black and Brown communities in particular, that were already believed themselves to be disenfranchised because of the system that they had in the United States. But it also furthered pre-existing narratives of divide between race and class warfare, and also there being a secret genocide, because also at the same time, we were seeing a lack of response from the LGBTQ community with regards to the AIDS epidemic, and so this was reinforcing that narrative. So overall, the KGB, the Secret Intelligence Agency for the Soviet Union, they effectively were planning things like forged documents, false evidence, and dubious articles in foreign reputable news outlets, again, this is that narrative laundering, in order to create an illusion that Russia was simply a spectator in this newfound truth. You know, they had nothing to do with the dissemination of it. Moreover, this was a very well-funded and centralized operation, very top-down. And then lastly, one of the interesting aspects here is that by the peak of the AIDS epidemic and so forth in the late 1980s, around 15% of Americans actually did believe HIV was created by the United States government. So in a way, is that possibly measuring a success of the influence operation? It possibly was. So that was for Operation Denver. So we'll proceed to secondary infection. So next slide, please. So moving from the Soviet Union and the historical case of Operation Denver, the Russian Federation in the modern day, they conducted a different type of influence operation, but also similar, and it's called secondary infection. And so for this, we were able to identify a similar amount of factors as was in Operation Denver. Again, emotional appeal, threat to identity, victim affirmation, almost pretty much the same. And then another sticking point here is that the narratives, like in Operation Denver, were simple, but they were much more diverse and numerous. So it was more of, as we would like to say, they were Russian actors were trying to throw whatever at the wall and see what sticks, versus how it was in Denver, which was much more concentrated. They knew what they wanted to say. They wanted to push out, so on and so forth. And so, again, they were trying to go after multiple targets. So they were aiming to divide Western countries, in particular, with a series of false narratives and through forged documents. Also sometimes as we call it, document drops. And this was trying to exacerbate already fragile government relationships. And also there was there was ample evidence that we were able to attribute this back to Russia based on forensic evidence, but also content we have seen from within the narratives and the artifacts that were collected. And again, there was also the issue of that with regards to artifacts, there was at least 2,500 pieces of content that was seen across 7 languages. And a lot of that was geared towards, again, these multiple and numerous and diverse narratives, such as attacking the United States, saying Ukraine is a failed state, US and NATO are aggressors, enhancing the European divisions, so on and so forth. But in more specific detail, when we look at the model that we have developed here and identifying these factors, we were able to extract a lot more compared to Operation Denver, map them more easily with the factors. So, for instance, in emotional appeal, a lot of the narratives were appealed to deep-seated tensions and fears in the non-dominant groups. So primarily immigrants and anti-immigrant media in Germany, again, a NATO state, race baiting within right-wing communities, and targeting online groups like Black and Brown and Asian communities. The other factor, like threat to identity, it was very, very targeted towards specific entities, both those that were on the fringe elements, right-wing groups and so forth, but then also to victims themselves. The other factor that was of really note was the threat to way of life, so culture. And it was more these narratives were pitting Western cultures against one another, again, to break down NATO, the cohesion between states, and so on and so forth. And so you saw this playing on major events such as like the Catalan independence movement, the Scottish independence movement, and even historical issues such as the Armenian genocide. Another area, another interesting factor that was identified was victim affirmation, and especially in this messaging, it really was provoking feelings of victimhood within a variety of specific groups. For instance, you saw a lot of messaging and the artifacts that were collected on affirming that immigrants are a threat to citizens and they're taking things away from citizens. And so this was active in places like the Brexit and so on and so forth, or Syrian refugee crisis. Another factor that we noted for was the clearly identified in-group and out-group. Again, we were seeing, because of the diverse nature of the targets, there wasn't one specific group, but there was multiple. And then actually that's a way that made this this operation a little probably less successful is because it was, again, they were going after so many different groups. It wasn't as structured or as top down, it seems. So there was something to be said there when they were going after multiple different targets and so different narratives and so forth. So this is an actually interesting factor to we have pointed out. And then the other response, the other interesting one was the lack of response. This narrative, this factor really did crop up many times, and it was very thematic across multiple countries, especially in the UK, Germany, France, and so forth, and in the United States. And it was playing on issues such as, like, you know, governments are not telling the full truth. They're covering things up, so to speak. And such as, like, an example being like Sweden's failure to stop a Brussels terror attack, right? You know, so, you know, two separate countries, but there was a conspiracy around that. So it's very interesting to see how we were able to identify these from the model. And so I'll wrap up with the last one, which is the Chinese COVID operation. Thank you. So for China, this was actually very different compared to the first two, because not only were those Russian, but the Chinese focused on three specific messaging, messages: the origin of the virus, how China responded to the outbreak and, you know, the subsequent pandemic, and then how China was trying to assist other countries in response to the pandemic. And then a less known, and I would say more of a secondary aspect to it, was they were trying to reverse the image, reverse the messaging about the origin of the virus. So trying to move it as, you know, the US created COVID, or US was in some way connected to it. And there was also some information about it as the US or UK and so forth. So the big thing here was, it was more of, you see, a crisis management kind of influence operation, where the aim was to control and change the messaging that was being propagated out of China, but then also what was being talked about China. But the messaging was also incredibly straightforward and very self-promoting. It was very much about maintaining a perception, especially about China's image in the world. And so in order to do that, unlike in the Russian examples, which were much more covert and so forth, this was very overt. China utilized its diplomatic corps to push out the messages, but it also used news outlets, both those owned, but also those friendly to China, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and so forth, to push out the message that of what China was trying to do, especially in regards to how they were trying to assist other countries in the pandemic. And so, and try to be mindful of time here, but one of the other things that, again, with the model that we were developing, we were able to extract a number of factors from analyzing these the Chinese COVID influence operations. And so one of them, again, was emotional appeal. And so they were looking at narratives were mostly geared towards, you know, appeal to the global fear of the rising pandemic, shutdowns, dying patients in Europe. Again, this was them trying to control the narrative away from China being responsible for it, and more on how they are trying to help mitigate it. There was, again, another one was, there was a threat to identity. Again, this was a very interesting area because it spawned a lot of anti-Asian racism throughout the world, and even particularly in the United States. And so again, China was trying to develop narratives that were, again, moving the blame away from them, but also trying to undermine the issue of undermine blame towards Asian communities, especially Chinese American or Chinese diaspora communities. Another one was victim affirmation. So this was a very unique factor that we were able to extract from this operation, is that the narrative was around, and the factor being, the US engineered COVID-19 as a way to target Chinese communities, but also weaken China as an economically. And then lastly, one of the other areas that was another factor that was very interesting was the social validation, the messaging that was propagated mainly through these official outlets and accounts, social media accounts. It was really trying to gain that social capital of like, all right, China is not the bad guy here. China is actually trying to make this, is working with the world and trying to make it so that it is not threatening, and that anything that is being said negatively about them is actually false. So, and then that really wraps up the case studies portion of this. And so I turn it back over to my colleague, Megan, who will go into the model refinement surveys.
Thank you, Rainer. So taking all of the information that we had gathered from the literature review and the case studies, we had kind of figured out that these are factors, and we've seen them in cases in the past and more recently with COVID. So the next step was to look at the US population, because our real question is, what is the impact on people? And so one of the key points to this is that we were looking at any action. So we wanted to know, we defined action as any increase in or development of a new action. So this could be anything from someone who has never used social media to getting on social media and joining groups, all the way up to a group committing violent action in the name of the movement. So what we wanted to look at with this survey is, what do people identify as reasons why they would take action? So we took all of the variables that we had and we transformed them into statements such as below, which is, I will definitely donate my time and or money to a cause or movement if the message conveys to me. And then we were able to apply all of the factors. So if it conveys to me that there's a problem that's not being handled, or etc. And we ran this through using Qualtrics, who was able to get us a population sample of 3,049 participants. And you can see below the breakdown of age, which was generally similar across the board, the gender, and then the residents, which account for the general population counts of those regions. And then we also looked at race, so that we had as similar to the general population as we could for this survey. So looking at these participants, we also looked at their education levels, whether they were married or not. We also asked if they had experienced financial difficulties throughout their life, because we wanted to know throughout their entirety of their lives, because we had research saying that financial difficulties in youth could have an impact versus financial difficulties in adulthood. So we asked them questions about that, and we also asked about their current employment status. And these are the answers that we received across those. Additionally, we asked questions looking at religiosity, so not type of religion, but how religious they believe themselves to be, their ideological inclination, moderate, conservative, and liberal, as well as an identity fusion index, which we had the participants name a group that they belong to, or like name the group that they interact with the most throughout their weeks or lives. And this identity fusion index is a series of images that demonstrate two circles, which would include the individual and the group identity. And as they get closer together, it determines how intertwined people believe they are with their groups. So you can see we had a broad range of A being not at all integrated with their group to E being completely integrated with the group. And upon those responses, we were able to look at what kind of groups people identified with and such. And then we finally asked, before we got into the actual questions, we asked if people believed that they had been exposed to either myth or disinformation. We also asked about their habits online and where they consumed news. And I will pass it to Steve to talk about the results that we got.
Thank you. So before I dive into the results of the survey in terms of determining what people thought, which parts of the narratives are most influential to them for action. One of the things that I would like to go back, sort of step back and give you a context on was that this research was born out of the research question looking specifically at people's actions and behavior change. What that means for us and for our sponsor was that we are particularly, or the research was particularly interested in how much does influence operation cause a person to change behavior or push someone to behave in a certain way, especially in a violent way, that ordinarily would not have. So with that, and so that was the focus, and so the scope of when we say the impact of the influence operation is quite narrow in that terms, and that is why you saw the questions that we asked. Actually, is that because when you say action in a broader term, right? You can say that me clicking on like on my Twitter account is an action. Well, that particular action does not equate to me picking up a weapon and going out and doing something about the issue. So while we cannot ask the question, would you pick up a gun and go out and work on this issue? The question that we came up with that was closest to sort of disaggregating between, yeah, I can click like on the Twitter feed versus I will actually commit some resources, significant amount of resources to do something about this, was asking the question about, do you want to would you actually donate money, and would you or would you actually spend time out of your day or out of your week to work on this issue? And that's why the question was designed the way that it was. And for all of the independent variables or the control variables that we had, as Megan went through, what we asked them really was, so actually for all of the participants, what we asked them was, for all the factors or all the variables that we have in the model, what you can see here on the slide, on the left-hand side, starting from emotion and ending with victimization, are all your individual level variables, and on the right-hand side, things are getting out of hand, all the way to it increases my reputation, are your societal level variables that we have included in our model. And what we have asked them was, hey, looking at these independent from each other, not thinking about anything else, if you see these sorts of variables conveyed in a message, as we kind of did in our case studies, as we were looking at the case studies, if you were looking at these messages and a message conveys it tries to do an emotional appeal to you, how much does that push you towards acting, right? Behaving in a way that what we would consider action that fits that question. And what you see here is that between the blue and the red line that goes across the x-axis, that's the range of the answers that needs to be for someone to say. This is an average aggregate. So that's the range that is neutral, meaning it has actually no bearing on me changing my behavior. Everything above the blue line agrees with the statement that, yeah, I would actually pick up something or do something about this. Everything below the red line is, no, I would definitely not do it. And what you see here is that all of the factors, as we kind of saw in the qualitative case studies, matter to people to different degrees. But one of the reasons we did this survey is because the literature currently tells you that all of these factors matter, but it doesn't tell you how important they are to people. Now, understanding that these importance are different based on the target audience, and our goal was to have a target audience for the US population. And so with the US population survey, what you see is that identity affirmation and victimization tends to matter. And 4 out of the 5 societal level variables matter, right? Things are getting out of hand. World could be better if I did something about it. There's not enough being done, and it is the right thing to do for the team. Or so basically, when you identify there's an in-group and there's an out-group, and so that I should do something about it so that the in-group is being benefited, people tend to agree with that. The one variable that people did not agree with and actually had a repulsive attitude towards is the increasing my reputation, which we actually kind of suspected that would be the case. What is interesting is that this is when I say this is an aggregate, this is the entire panel. And so this is the average of the entire panel. What is interesting is when we broke the panel down into various demographic characteristics that Megan went through, the results came back pretty similar regardless of who you were. And I always will run through some slides right after this to show you that. So next slide, please. So the next one is by age group. So we said, well, age group, young people may have different answers than the older people, et cetera, et cetera. But what you can see is that the black line that you see on the right part of every single one of these variables is the aggregate results that you saw in the previous slide. And then what you see in the color bars are the different demographics, right? So the younger folks tended to think that identity affirmation was important, but so did the folks that are in the middle, the 35 to 54. And so forth. So while there were some nuanced differences between the age groups, but overall, except maybe for the over 55 group in the increasing my reputation, overall the results were pretty similar to each other, regardless of the age group. Next. Similar here with the gender. We did not include the non-binary in this particular chart because with 1% of the population, the participants answering that, it did not come out to mean there was too much variance there. So we took them out. But so with the female and male gender groups, which was 52 and 47% of the participant, is still borne out similar to the overall result. Next. And then same thing, similar with the race. Not a lot of difference there. Again, slide please. And region of residence. And a lot of people thought that the research team, and when we were designing this, and we said, well, people from the South may have a very different view of the world than the people from the North. And originally being from Texas, I can tell you that we have a very different view of the world from Maryland. So we thought, yeah, maybe that's a thing. And it turns out that it's not as big of a thing as we thought. Next. Marital status, similar. Okay, and then I think the next one. Political ideology, right? So one thing of interest here is that while the overall results seem the same, right? What you can see is that the red bars are higher than everybody else, right? So it does not indicate that they're different in terms of results. What it does indicate is that the folks that have identified themselves as liberal tend to want to act more than the other groups. That's what it seems to be indicate, rather than indicating difference in on what part of the narrative do you actually feel that you want to behave differently. Okay, next. And then same thing, similar with the religious. And in this case, the yellow bars are the higher, but the reasoning are similar to what we saw in the political ideology. Okay. So those were what we, go ahead to the next slide. And those were what we did for as a sort of a descriptive averages for the Likert scale that we asked the questions on. And then what we actually also did is we ran some MANOVA model, and came up with, we looked at what are the statistically significant variables based on our answers. And what you see here are essentially the boxes that are marked with X are the the variables that were shown as statistically significant. Variables marked with X at a minus is, statistically significant in a negative way, meaning that you're less likely to act if you were, say, a moderate looking at the identity affirmation as a part of the narrative. But at the end of the day, the identity affirmation at the individual level, the identity affirmation had the highest impact in terms of statistical significance for our panel. Next. And for the societal level impact, we were able to note that the clear alternative future, so people tend to behave or act on a message if they believe that the message is conveying that by action, you can change the world for the better. And specifically, we asked them changing the world for the better. So that's what the results were. Okay. And so what does all this mean? I showed you a lot of the charts, and Reiner talked about case studies and et cetera. So what we found really is that within the case studies, as we sort of suspected from the literature review, that as we use the variables that we collected from the literature, more of these variables the narrative contains tends to have people's reaction, tends to grab people's reaction, which was not too much of a surprise in those from that perspective. But it was also, I say that the interesting part about our study, in the case study, really is that the ability for us to actually pick out these different variables within the narratives, and they were actually not very difficult to pick out. Are we appealing to emotion or are we appealing to victimization? Because that was actually one of our concerns. And the reason for that was that not only were we looking for, how do we identify impact or what variables have higher impact on people to decide on action, but at the end of the research, our goal was to develop an assessment tool that an analyst can use to quickly look at a message, quickly look at a narrative and say, I see that victimization is in here, and it's a very clear message of victimization. And what does that mean in terms of impact? Because at the end of the day, the assessment tool was designed so that the folks that are looking at misdis and malinformation can quickly do some prioritization and to triage which message that we need to counter first, because we don't have unlimited resources to go after all of the narratives. So that was sort of the intent behind the project. Really was to design those kind of that type of assessment tool. So one of the things that we were really worried about with our model is that can an analyst actually identify these variables that we say are indicative of your impact? And so case studies actually proved that we were able to do so. And for the survey, the real reason for the back end reason for the survey was not only to get these cool data points, but really we wanted to use the survey as the weights for each one of these variables. Because one of the things that the literature does a great job is to identify what are the factors that people gravitate towards, and in terms of believing the message or not believing the message, or doing action or not doing action. What it doesn't tell you is that which one of these variables are actually more important to the person. And to a certain extent, it's fair to say that, well, the variable that act on me is probably very different than the variable act on you all. So that it is not a failure of the literature not to identify which one is more important. But for our purposes, we needed to identify, in general, which ones are more or less important to a specific group of population. And so the survey was able to give us that. And we were able to identify there were certain variables that are really sort of important to people in terms of them thinking, the self-identifying that they are going to act on this by way of donation or volunteering their time. But really, what was surprising about this was that unlike what our original thought or originally hypothesized, that we will have people depending on what their ideologies were, or depending on where they grew up and how, the environment that they grew up in, et cetera, they would have different answers, and different variables would be different. The importance of the variables will be different. But what we found is that while there were some differences on how important these variables were to each person, the overall, it didn't really matter what your background was in terms of identifying which variables are important to begin with. Now, so when you say a clear alternative future, the world will be better if I did something, again, my perspective of world will be better may be very different from every one of your perspective of world will be different or better. But what the results are showing you is that everybody thinks that world will be better is a good thing, no matter what that looks like. So from a influence operations operator perspective, it would not matter whether you think the world being better is a very, very liberal democracy versus a very, autocratic society. Because all I need to do is to sow that message into your head, and you are thinking that the world will be better is a good thing, and you're going to go do your thing. And if that causes the society to fail because we are now clashing with each other, then mission accomplished for the influencer, right? So that is what we're seeing in that particular result for the survey. So which was I think is probably the most important finding that we had in the survey. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Megan and Reiner, and they're going to go over how we developed all of this, put all of this package together into an assessment tool. And then we will wrap up with some concluding thoughts.
Thanks, Steve. So this is where we ended up with the visualization of the tool. The process that we took in order to develop this was to look at each of these variables that we found, the weighting provided by the surveys, of course, and we built rankings from 0 to 3, which 0 being that this variable is not in this message, and 3 being it's directly spoken to in the message, and it's pointing directly at this. And so that varies depending on the variable that you're looking at, but in general, that was how you would be able to code these. So at the bottom, you can see that after coding all of these, you would get a range. You would get your final score, and that would fall into one of these ranges, with blue being the least likely to create action and red being the most likely to create action within that the target community. And we built this in order to be used across all media forms. So looking at a single meme image or a single tweet, as well as looking at long form essays or videos or podcasts or comment sections or blogs. So really this can be used across any media form that you come across. It can be used to look at a variety of different influence operations or narratives and messaging to see which one could be the most impactful, or you can look at several messages within one narrative or one campaign and see what should be causing the most traction within that community. Reiner, did I miss anything there?
No, you didn't. So if you want to continue on to the next slide, I can go over some of the testing results and so forth.
Yeah, so once we developed this tool, we then did some internal testing and some external testing with the funder to see how it worked and if there were any modifications that could be made.
Yeah, so and in this case, this is the test with the external. And so again, as Megan was discussed earlier just a few moments ago, is that this tool is actually meant to work on different types of for different types of mediums. And in this case, when we were testing with the external, we were doing snapshots from across thumbnails, things that you would see on Twitter, tweets, thumbnails that you would have from notifications, so on and so forth. And they were from a variety of sources, not just from Twitter and so forth, but we wanted to also gauge that if people were able to identify there is, disinformation, or this is, a narrative that's being targeted towards them. So we have, in this case, the innocuous legitimate outlet of CNN, and then you have the next two, which is the Fauci one by the Scoop, that's actually from a Russian campaign with regards to COVID. The third one is a tweet that is by the Chinese, by a Chinese entity, an official actually, and interestingly enough, this official did not have a designation on Twitter as a Chinese state account, which is very unique. And then the following two were domestically focused narratives, specifically one on social anti-transgender narrative, and then the last one was on the quote unquote woke military. And across, as you see, between the individual and societal levels, variables, there's actually, it's very interesting to see, it's that there is, on the low tier, CNN, whereas on the higher end, you actually have domestic. Both the domestic narratives that we were able to, artifacts that we pulled for the externals, they scored the highest. And then in succession, it was the Chinese narrative about Australia. And again, the last one there is the Russian narrative with regards to Fauci. But interesting, I think what was most engaged for me personally is seeing how social validation, everyone else is doing it, so it increases my reputation, had a unique amount of, it was zero both in the CNN one, but then it was also zero in the anti-West Australian narrative. Megan, if you have any insights here that you found very interesting, please feel free to share.
Yeah, I think you covered it. I think that this also speaks to, these are kind of the culminations of rankings that we receive from our external testing. And so it is interesting to see how some variables can be rated higher for certain narratives.
Yes, and I think also one of the things that we extracted from this, especially on the test artifact number 3 for Australia, the external, those who were taking it were not Australian or anything. These were all Americans taking this test. So perhaps that it scored maybe a little bit lower. It may have scored higher if it was more pertinent to maybe the community or the surveyors, who knows. But it is interesting to see how high it did score into the second tier. So those are my notes on that. And we are looking to expand this further. So looking at, people watching videos and so forth as an artifact and how they can score on those. So that's for the future.
Yeah, I think Rainer, you almost touched on the final point that I will make, is that we gave our testers very specific instructions to simply look at the content of the articles and not infer any reaction from a targeted group. So this is simply what you can see from what is directly in front of you. And with that, I will turn it back to Steve for our conclusion.
All right, thank you very much. So the concluding thought is that in terms of this research and this tool, I think is a step forward in understanding from the social science perspective on assessing what the influence of the impact of the influence operations is, which can complement the technical approaches that we currently have, which essentially we're looking at propagation and duration of the life cycle of the message. So combining those two, I think, will give us a better understanding of which one of these narratives and operations are having more of the impact in our society. Now, the other part is that as we continuously said, this was used a panel of American adult population. And so this particular result and this particular assessment tool is very specific to that target audience. What that means is, we are very cognizant that if we change the target audience, you're going to have to do this again, right? So your survey results may change, which means your weights may change, and thus the assessment tool will need to be updated. And so as the state of the art for the influence operations, as well as the society evolves, as we, even within the US population, as we evolve, we will have to refresh this periodically so that we are getting the most current and the correct input. And so, and I think that my colleagues have pointed out that this methodology allows you to do various tests in terms of medium that the impact of the influence operations are coming across. Although we've used a lot of it as a online testing or the online message, this could be done with offline messaging as well. So those are our current concluding thoughts, and we are currently in the as mentioned in the process of refining the assessment tool for our sponsorship, and then and hopefully we'll have some peer review manuscripts coming out of this research.
Sounds great.
Some time for questions.
We do. We do have a couple of minutes for questions. I'll remind our attendees that if you do have any questions, you're welcome to drop it in the Q&A, and we'll take a look at those there. I'm going to talk a little slowly in case anybody's furiously typing in the Q&A section and get their question in. We do have a hard stop at 2 o'clock, but we still have a couple minutes before then. In case you need to jump off, or in case you kind of think of the question later, I did just drop everyone's email addresses. You can see them on the screen. And I also dropped everyone's email addresses in the chat so that you are able to reach out to them after the presentation. So I think I have given people kind of a minute to consider any questions that they might have. We have one question. Do you intend to pursue this research through other case studies?
So the short answer is yes. As we designed this methodology, the case studies or use cases can be done on any others. And so one of the things that we were immediately thinking about domestically actually is doing a case study using this methodology on the veterans community. The post-January 6th have some concerns with the veterans community, and I think it's worthwhile take a look at what makes that particular community or parts of that community tick. And within the veterans community, there's an interest in doing having a better understanding of their own community as well. So that's, I think, it's one of our lowest hanging fruit in terms of our next plan. But the other case studies we're thinking about as well that are specifically sort of foreign influence operation types.
Great, thank you, Steve. Although we should perhaps say our community, considering that both Steve and I are Army veterans.
That's true. Yeah. That is true. So I'm slightly biased in that perspective. That we're gonna try to look at our own community and police ourselves.
Yeah, I would even add on, Steve, to this. It's like also what's been recent because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the information operations that have been geared towards the U.S. population by both these actors, because it is an interesting area, especially when it comes to support for this war or so forth. So that'd be interesting possibly later down the road for possible study.
Yeah, that is very true.
And I think now we're at the end of our questions, which is all right. We have a nice 4 minutes that we can kind of give everybody back in their day. Again, like I said, if you have any questions at all after this, like I said, you're welcome to reach out to the folks on the call here. And So I wanted to say thank you to our panelists. I think this was a great presentation and I appreciate your time today.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, thanks everyone.
Thank you all.
And for our other attendees, thank you very much for joining us today. You're welcome to take a look at this information, other information that we have on this project on our website, or sign up for a monthly newsletter. But otherwise, I'll just say I hope everyone has a great day, and we'll see you at the next event.